The champagne glasses caught the afternoon light like tiny prisons, each one reflecting a truth I wasn't ready to face. My wedding day was supposed to be perfect. White dress, fresh flowers, 200 guests filling every pew of St. Matthew's Cathedral. But as I stood at the altar looking out at the crowd, 3 entire rows sat empty. The rows I'd reserved for family. The rows that should have held my parents, my brother, my aunts and uncles who'd watched me grow up. Instead, white ribbons marked empty seats like tombstones in a graveyard of broken promises. My name is Commander Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy. I've led missions in hostile waters, commanded teams through storms that could swallow ships whole, and made decisions that saved lives when seconds mattered. But nothing in my military training prepared me for walking down that aisle alone, the click of my heels echoing in a silence that screamed louder than any enemy fire I'd ever faced. The organ began to play. Pachelbel's Canon, the same piece my mother had hummed when I was 8 years old, standing on a kitchen chair while she pinned my hem for the school play. Back then, she'd promised she'd be there for all my big moments. Graduations, promotions, my wedding day. She'd sworn on her grandmother's Bible that family came first, always and forever. That promise felt like smoke now, dissipating the moment I needed it most. David waited at the altar. My soon-to-be husband stood there in his dress blues, steady as the lighthouse he'd grown up watching from his bedroom window in Maine. His eyes met mine across that sea of faces and empty spaces. He didn't flinch at the absence. He didn't look embarrassed or confused. He just smiled, the kind of smile that says everything will be okay even when the world is tilting sideways. I'd met David 3 years earlier at a joint training exercise. He was Coast Guard, the kind of officer who could navigate through fog so thick you couldn't see your own hands. We'd talked for hours that first night about duty, honor, and the weight of wearing a uniform. He understood the sacrifice, the long deployments, the way military life carved pieces out of your personal world. What he didn't understand yet was how deep those cuts could go. The congregation rose as I began my walk. 200 people stood in respect, but the only sounds were my footsteps and the whisper of silk against marble. Mrs. Henderson from down the street dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Lieutenant Commander Torres, my former supervisor, stood at attention. David's family filled the right side of the church, warm faces glowing with joy and welcome. But the left side, my side, looked like a beautiful smile with half the teeth missing. 6 months of planning had led to this moment. 6 months of phone calls, seating charts, menu tastings, and dress fittings. 6 months of hoping against hope that my family would come around, that they'd realize their anger wasn't worth missing their daughter's wedding day. I'd sent the invitations with handwritten notes. Please, I'd written to my mother, this is important to me. I'd called my brother twice a week, trying to bridge the gap that had grown between us since my last promotion. I'd even swallowed my pride and reached out to my father, the man who'd stopped speaking to me the day I made commander. The rift had started small, the way most family fractures do. A comment here, a missed dinner there, a slow accumulation of resentments that built like sediment in a harbor. My father had wanted me to follow his path into engineering. Safe, predictable, close to home. When I chose the Naval Academy instead, he'd called it a phase. When I graduated with honors, he'd said I was showing off. When I earned my dolphins and qualified for submarine duty, he'd stopped returning my calls altogether. My mother had tried to play peacemaker for years, hosting Sunday dinners where we all pretended the tension wasn't thick enough to cut with a knife. She'd make my father's favorite pot roast and my favorite apple pie, setting the table with the good china like she could force harmony through proper place settings. But even she had her limits. The final break came 6 months before my wedding, when I'd been selected for a prestigious command position. Instead of congratulations, I'd received a letter from my father explaining why he could no longer support what he called my selfish pursuit of glory. My brother had chosen sides, the way children do in messy divorces. He'd always been the golden child, the one who stayed close to home, who gave my parents grandchildren and holiday traditions. When forced to choose between his sister's wedding and his parents' approval, he'd picked the path of least resistance. The last text I'd received from him was brutal in its simplicity. "Can't make it. Sorry, but I'd hoped." Right up until that morning, I'd checked my phone for messages, listened for the sound of car doors slamming in the parking lot, watched the church entrance for familiar faces. Hope is a dangerous thing for a military officer. It makes you vulnerable, clouds your judgment, leads to tactical errors that can cost lives. But I couldn't help myself. They were my family. Blood should count for something. The walk down that aisle felt endless, each step a choice between dignity and despair. I could feel the congregation's eyes on me, could sense their confusion and pity. Some knew about the family situation. Others were probably wondering why such a beautiful ceremony felt so hollow, why the bride looked like she was marching to her execution instead of her future. Halfway down the aisle, I caught sight of Chief Petty Officer Williams, a grizzled veteran who'd served under my command during my first deployment. He stood ramrod straight, his dress uniform immaculate, his weathered face set in lines of respect and determination. When our eyes met, he gave me the slightest nod. Not sympathy, not pity, but acknowledgement, warrior to warrior. "You've got this," that nod said. "You've survived worse." And I had. I'd survived the isolation of being one of the few women in submarine service. I'd survived the doubt of superior officers who thought I was too young, too inexperienced, too female for command. I'd survived missions where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats, where a single wrong decision could send 100 souls to the bottom of the ocean. I'd proven myself in waters where weakness meant death and strength was the only currency that mattered. So why did walking down this aisle without my father's arm feel harder than anything I'd faced in uniform? Why did the absence of my mother's tears feel more devastating than enemy torpedoes? Maybe because in the military you expect the fight. You train for it, prepare for it, accept it as part of the job. But family is supposed to be your safe harbor, the place where you can drop anchor and rest. When that harbor is empty, you're left drifting in open water with nowhere to go. The chaplain waited at the altar, a kind-faced man who'd counseled David and me through our pre-marital sessions. He'd asked gentle questions about our backgrounds, our families, our plans for the future. When I'd explained the situation with my parents, he'd nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human frailty. "Forgiveness is a process," he'd said. "Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like." David's best man, his brother Jake, shot me an encouraging smile as I approached. Jake was everything my brother wasn't: loyal, supportive, present. He'd flown in from Seattle just to stand beside his brother, had spent the bachelor party telling embarrassing stories and making toasts to lasting love. When I'd lost my maid of honor to my family's boycott, Jake had quietly arranged for his wife to step in. No questions asked, no drama created. The music swelled as I took my final steps toward the altar. 200 guests held their breath, waiting to see how this would end. Would the bride collapse under the weight of abandonment? Would she run from the church in tears? Would she let her family's cruelty poison what should have been the happiest day of her life? I reached David and placed my hand in his. His fingers were warm, steady, real. When he squeezed gently, I felt something inside me settle. This was my choice, my future, my new beginning. The empty seats behind me were part of my past, but they didn't have to define my tomorrow. The chaplain began to speak, his voice carrying across the cathedral like a prayer made audible. "We were gathered here today," he said, "to witness the union of two souls who had chosen love over fear, commitment over convenience, hope over hurt." His words washed over me like absolution, reminding me why I was here and what really mattered. But even as I stood there trying to focus on the ceremony, trying to lose myself in the moment, I'd dreamed of since childhood. A part of me kept listening for the sound of doors opening, kept watching for movement in my peripheral vision. Because despite everything, despite the letters and the silence and the cruel finality of their absence, I still believed in miracles. I still thought love might win in the end. That belief would be tested sooner than I could imagine. The ceremony moved forward with military precision. Words about love and commitment echoed through the cathedral while I fought to stay present, to focus on David's face instead of the hollow ache where family support should have been. The chaplain spoke about the bonds that hold people together through storms, about choosing your battles and knowing when to lay down your weapons. Every phrase felt deliberate, crafted for a bride whose war wasn't with enemies across distant seas, but with the people who'd raised her. When it came time for the vows, my voice didn't waver. Years of issuing commands under pressure had taught me how to project strength, even when my foundation was cracking. I promised David forever, promised him loyalty that wouldn't bend under pressure, promised him the kind of steadfast love I'd never received from the people who'd taught me what love was supposed to look like. His eyes never left mine as he made the same promises back, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood what it meant to be the only steady thing in another person's storm. The rings slipped into place with quiet finality, gold bands that would outlast the hurt, outlast the silence, outlast the empty chairs that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, the congregation erupted in applause that felt like thunder rolling through the cathedral. David kissed me with gentle determination, the kind of kiss that said we'd made it through the hardest part. But we hadn't. Not even close. The reception was held at the Harbor Club overlooking Chesapeake Bay. White linens and crystal glasses caught the late afternoon sun, transforming the ballroom into something that belonged in magazines. David's family had spared no expense, had treated this celebration like their own daughter was getting married. His mother, Eleanor, had spent weeks coordinating with the caterer, the florist, the band. She'd stepped into the role my mother had abandoned, had filled the vacuum with grace and determination. I moved through the receiving line like I was conducting an inspection. Firm handshakes, genuine smiles, heartfelt thanks for people who'd chosen to witness our beginning. Officers from my command offered congratulations mixed with barely concealed concern. They knew about the family situation, had watched me navigate the weeks leading up to the wedding with the kind of rigid composure that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of my most promising officers, squeezed my hand as she moved through the line. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "you look beautiful and strong." That last word carried extra weight. She'd grown up in a military family, understood the particular pain of disappointing parents who'd sacrificed everything for duty and honor. When I'd mentored her through her own family crisis 2 years earlier, I'd told her that strength wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about feeling it fully and choosing to move forward anyway. The dinner courses came and went like scenes from someone else's life. Prime rib and roasted vegetables, wine that cost more per bottle than I'd spent on groceries in a month, conversations that swirled around me while I sat at the head table trying to look like a bride instead of a commanding officer maintaining tactical awareness. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted to the empty table I'd reserved for family. 8 place settings that would never be filled, white roses that would never be appreciated, name cards that spelled out the absence in elegant calligraphy. David's father stood to give a toast, his weathered hand steady around a champagne flute. Robert Mitchell was everything my father wasn't. Warm, present, proud, without reservation. He'd welcomed me into his family with the kind of open-armed enthusiasm usually reserved for war heroes coming home. Tonight he raised his glass and spoke about the daughter he'd gained, about watching 2 people choose each other despite the odds, about building new traditions when old ones failed. "To Sarah," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "who taught my son that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth fighting for." The applause that followed felt like armor, protecting me from the silence that had followed me down the aisle. As the evening wore on, the music grew louder and the laughter more frequent. David spun me around the dance floor while the band played songs we'd chosen together, melodies that told our story better than words ever could. His arms felt like the safest place in the world, like a harbor where I could finally drop anchor and rest. For long stretches, I forgot about the empty spaces, forgot about the letters I'd never received and the phone calls that had gone unanswered. But then the band took a break, and in the sudden quiet, my phone buzzed against my clutch purse. A text from an unknown number. My heart jumped before my brain could engage, that desperate hope flaring again despite everything. Maybe they'd changed their minds. Maybe love had won after all. The message was from my brother. 5 words that hit like torpedoes finding their target. "Dad's on his way over." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred together. David noticed my stillness, the way my body had gone rigid despite the champagne and the warmth of the ballroom. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. I showed him the message. His jaw tightened, that protective instinct kicking in, that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. Simple, direct, supportive. No judgment, no questions about why I'd want to avoid my own father on my wedding day. Before I could answer, Eleanor appeared at my elbow. She'd been watching me all evening with the sharp eyes of a mother who'd learned to read dangerous weather patterns. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from raising 3 sons and managing a household that ran on military schedules. I handed her my phone. She read the message twice, her expression shifting from confusion to anger to something harder to define. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose we'll find out what he wants." What he wanted became clear 20 minutes later when the ballroom doors opened and my father walked in flanked by 2 Norfolk police officers. The music didn't stop immediately, but conversations died like dominoes falling across the room. 300 guests turned to stare at the man who'd chosen this moment, this place, this day, to make whatever point he'd been building toward for months. My father looked older than I remembered, his shoulders stooped beneath a suit that hung loose on his frame. But his eyes held the same cold determination that had dominated my childhood, the same conviction that he was right, and everyone else was simply too weak to see it. The police officers looked uncomfortable, like men who'd been dragged into a family dispute they wanted no part of. David stepped in front of me without being asked, his body language shifting into protective mode. Around us, his family closed ranks with the kind of silent coordination that spoke to years of supporting each other through crisis. Eleanor moved to my right side, Robert to my left. Jake positioned himself near the band, ready to signal them to keep playing if needed. The ballroom held its breath as my father approached our table. Each step echoed in the sudden silence, each footfall marking time until whatever explosion he'd brought with him finally detonated. I stood slowly, my dress rustling like whispered prayers, and faced the man who'd taught me to stand straight and speak clearly and never back down from a fight. He'd just given me the chance to use every lesson he'd ever taught me. The silence stretched between us like a minefield, every second loaded with the potential for devastation. My father stood 10 feet away, close enough that I could see the lines grief had carved around his eyes, far enough that the distance felt like an ocean. The police officers flanked him like reluctant honor guards, their expressions caught between duty and discomfort. "Sarah," he said, my name falling from his lips like a foreign word he'd forgotten how to pronounce. His voice carried across the ballroom, cutting through the whispered conversations and nervous shuffling of 300 guests who'd suddenly found themselves witnesses to something that belonged behind closed doors. I didn't respond immediately. Years of command had taught me the power of silence, how it could make the other party reveal their hand before you showed yours. Around me, David's family maintained their protective formation, a wall of support I'd never experienced before. Eleanor's hand found mine, her fingers steady and warm. Robert shifted slightly, positioning himself where he could step between my father and me if necessary. The police officers looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The older one, a sergeant with silver threading through his dark hair, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me directly. We received a call about a domestic disturbance. Your father claims there's been theft of family property. The words hit the ballroom like a depth charge. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests tried to process what they were hearing. Theft? At a wedding reception? David's jaw clenched beside me, his hands forming fists before he caught himself and forced them to relax. Professional military bearing, even in crisis. My father stepped forward, emboldened by the official presence at his back. "She took my grandmother's ring," he announced, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone who'd convinced himself he was the victim in this story. "Stole it right out of my house when she knew I was planning to give it to her brother for his engagement." The accusation landed like a slap across my face. Every eye in the ballroom turned to my left hand, to the simple gold band David had placed there less than 4 hours ago. Not my grandmother's ring. Not the elaborate family heirloom my father was describing. A ring we'd chosen together, paid for together, that had never spent a single day in my childhood home. "Sir," the younger officer said carefully, "can you identify the ring in question?" My father's confidence wavered for just a moment, uncertainty flickering across his features like static on a broken radio. He squinted at my hand from across the room, then back at the officers. It's an antique setting, diamond surrounded by smaller stones, been in our family for generations." I looked down at my wedding ring. Simple gold band, no stones, no elaborate setting. Nothing that could be confused with the ring he was describing. The ring that had sat in my grandmother's jewelry box for 30 years untouched and unworn. The ring I'd never taken, never touched, never even seen outside of old family photographs. David stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension with military precision. "Officers, I'd like to show you the receipt for my wife's wedding ring. We purchased it together 6 months ago from Tiffany and Company in Norfolk. I have the documentation in my jacket pocket." The sergeant nodded, relief evident in his posture. This was something concrete, something he could verify and resolve. David retrieved the small velvet box. From his inner pocket, the receipt still folded neatly inside. He handed it to the officer, who examined it carefully before showing it to his partner. "Sir," the sergeant said to my father, "this ring was purchased new 6 months ago. It's not the family heirloom you described." My father's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment warring for control of his expression. "She has other jewelry," he insisted, his voice rising. "Things that belong to the family. Things she had no right to take when she left." The room held its breath as I reached into my clutch purse and pulled out a small jewelry box. My hands were steady as I opened it, revealing the only pieces of family jewelry I'd ever owned. My grandmother's pearl earrings, given to me on my 16th birthday. A simple gold cross my mother had pressed into my hands the day I left for the Naval Academy. A class ring from my father's college days, passed down when I graduated from Annapolis. "These?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "The earrings Grandma gave me herself? The cross Mom said would keep me safe? The ring you gave me when I made you proud by following in your footsteps?" Each item felt like evidence in a trial I'd never wanted to be part of. I'd treasured these pieces, had worn them during important moments throughout my career. The earrings at my commissioning ceremony, the cross during my first deployment, the ring when I'd taken my first command. They were my connection to family, to the people who'd shaped me before duty and distance carved canyons between us. My father stared at the jewelry box, recognition dawning in his eyes. These weren't stolen treasures. They were gifts freely given, memories made tangible, love expressed in gold and stone and pearl. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving behind a man who looked older and smaller than when he'd walked through those doors. "I thought," he began, then stopped. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of whatever had driven him to this moment. Whatever pain had convinced him that his daughter's wedding day was the appropriate time for accusations and police intervention. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd spent decades managing crises with grace and efficiency. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could speak privately to resolve this matter." The sergeant nodded gratefully, clearly eager to extract himself and his partner from what was obviously a family dispute that had gotten wildly out of hand. "Ma'am, if we could use a private room for a few minutes?" The manager of the Harbor Club appeared as if summoned, wringing his hands and shooting apologetic glances at the wedding party. He led the small group toward his office, leaving the ballroom in a state of suspended animation. 300 guests sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether to resume their conversations or wait for resolution. I remained standing beside our table, my wedding dress suddenly feeling like armor that weighed too much. David's hand found the small of my back, a steady presence that kept me anchored when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. The band members fidgeted with their instruments, clearly uncertain whether to resume playing or pack up and leave. Jake appeared at my other side, his face grim but determined. "You want me to get everyone dancing again?" he asked quietly. "Take the attention off this whole mess?" I shook my head. "Let them see," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Let them see what happens when family becomes the enemy." Minutes passed like hours before the office door opened and the group emerged. My father walked between the officers, his head down, hands clasped behind his back like a man being led to his execution. The sergeant approached our table with the careful politeness of someone delivering news no one wanted to hear. "Ma'am," he said, "there's no evidence of any theft. Your father has withdrawn his complaint." He paused, glancing back at the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to tie my shoes and drive a car and stand up for what I believed in. "He asked me to tell you he's sorry for the disruption." Sorry for the disruption. Not sorry for the accusation. Not sorry for trying to have me arrested at my own wedding reception. Not sorry for choosing public humiliation over private conversation. Sorry for the disruption, like he'd spilled wine on the tablecloth instead of trying to destroy the most important day of my life. The officers left without ceremony, their duty discharged and their involvement in our family drama officially concluded. My father remained near the office door, uncertain whether he was welcome to stay or expected to leave. Around the ballroom, conversations slowly resumed, as guests processed what they'd witnessed and tried to return to celebration mode. David squeezed my hand gently. "Your call," he said simply. "Whatever you want to do." I looked across the room at my father, this man who'd once been my hero, who'd taught me that honor mattered more than comfort, and that standing up for your principles was worth any price. He'd shaped me into the officer I'd become, had instilled in me the values that had carried me through every challenge my career had thrown my way. Now he stood alone in his wrinkled suit, surrounded by the debris of whatever had driven him to this desperate act. His pride had cost him his daughter's wedding day. His need to control had transformed him from the man who'd once lifted me onto his shoulders to see the 4th of July fireworks into someone I barely recognized. I walked toward him slowly, my heels clicking against the polished floor like a metronome counting down to some unknown conclusion. The ballroom fell silent again as 300 guests watched to see how this scene would end. Would there be reconciliation? Would there be forgiveness? Would there be another explosion? When I reached him, I stopped just outside arm's length, close enough to see the regret beginning to cloud his eyes, far enough to maintain the distance he'd created with months of silence and years of disapproval. "Why?" I asked simply. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Words seemed to stick in his throat like bones. I wanted... He shook his head, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "You wanted to hurt me," I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "On my wedding day, in front of everyone who matters to me, you wanted to make sure I knew exactly how little I mean to you." "That's not," he began. But the protest died before it could gain momentum. Because we both knew it was true. This wasn't about stolen jewelry or family property. This was about a father who couldn't forgive his daughter for becoming something he'd never imagined, for succeeding in ways that made his own accomplishments feel small. The silence stretched between us one final time. Then I did something that surprised us both. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small jewelry box again. Without a word, I removed each piece. The pearl earrings, the gold cross, the class ring. I placed them carefully on the nearest table, arranging them like evidence in a case that was finally closed. "These belong to your family," I said quietly. "I'm not part of that anymore." I turned away from him and walked back to David, back to the people who'd chosen to celebrate with us instead of tear us down. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of my father's footsteps as he gathered up the jewelry I'd returned to him. When the ballroom doors closed behind him, they made a sound like a book slamming shut on a chapter I was finally ready to finish. The band resumed playing without being asked. Eleanor signaled the waitstaff to refresh everyone's drinks. Jake grabbed the microphone and announced that the happy couple would now cut their cake, his voice determinedly cheerful as he guided the reception back toward celebration. But as David and I posed with the knife above our three-tiered cake, as photographers captured our smiles and guests applauded our resilience, I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, exactly, not relief either. Something harder to name, like the moment after a storm when you realize you've survived something you weren't sure you could weather. The cake cutting felt like a performance, each smile carefully orchestrated for cameras that would preserve this moment long after the pain had faded. David's hand covered mine on the knife handle, his warmth steadying me as we sliced through fondant and buttercream layers that Eleanor had spent weeks perfecting. The photographer captured our practiced joy, the kind of happiness that looks real enough in pictures but feels hollow when you're living inside it. As guests applauded and champagne flutes clinked around us, I caught sight of Lieutenant Chen approaching with careful steps. Her dress uniform was immaculate, her expression respectful but concerned. When she reached us, she leaned close enough that only David and I could hear her words. "Ma'am, there's something you should know. Your father didn't leave after the police escorted him out. He's been sitting in his car in the parking lot for the past hour." My stomach dropped like an anchor finding bottom. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the harbor stretched out in darkness, punctuated by ship lights and navigation beacons. Somewhere beyond that glass, in the parking lot where valets hustled between luxury cars and military vehicles, my father sat alone with whatever demons had driven him to this point. David's grip tightened on my hand. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made him such an effective Coast Guard officer. He'd dealt with desperate people before, had talked jumpers off bridges and calmed panicked sailors in storms that threatened to swallow entire crews. I shook my head. This was mine to finish, mine to resolve, or let die in that parking lot under the Virginia stars. "No, but come with me?" Eleanor appeared at my elbow as if summoned by maternal radar. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice sharp with the kind of protective concern I'd never experienced from my own mother. "To end this," I said simply. She studied my face for a long moment, reading something in my expression that satisfied whatever test she was conducting. "Robert and I will keep the party going. Take as long as you need." The harbor air hit my face like a baptism as David and I stepped outside. Salt and diesel fuel, the familiar sense of a life lived near water. My heels clicked against asphalt as we walked between rows of cars toward a sedan I recognized despite the years that had passed since I'd last seen it. My father's old Buick, the same car he'd taught me to drive in, the same car that had carried us to church every Sunday when I was young enough to believe family meant forever. He sat behind the wheel with his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead like a man contemplating a horizon only he could see. The dome light cast harsh shadows across features that had grown gaunt with whatever weight he'd been carrying. When he saw us approaching, he rolled down the window with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been expecting this confrontation. "Sarah," he said, my name escaping like a confession. Up close, I could see the exhaustion that lined his face. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from fighting wars you can't win. I'm not here to cause more trouble. Then why are you here? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the storm building in my chest. David positioned himself slightly behind me and to the right, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough to let me handle this my way. My father's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. I don't know, he admitted, the words cracking like ice under pressure. I sat here for an hour trying to think of what to say, how to explain what happened in there. I keep coming up empty. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the man who'd raised me with absolute certainty, who'd never admitted doubt or uncertainty about anything. This was someone stripped down to raw humanity, all the armor of righteousness finally discarded. You tried to have me arrested, I said, each word measured and deliberate. At my own wedding, in front of everyone who matters to me. You accused me of stealing from family that disowned me months ago. He flinched as if I'd struck him. I know how it looked. How it looked? The words exploded out of me before I could stop them. Dad, you brought police to my wedding reception. You stood in front of 300 people and called me a thief. There's no interpretation here. There's no misunderstanding. You tried to destroy the most important day of my life. David's hand found my shoulder, a gentle reminder to breathe, to maintain the discipline that had carried me through every crisis my career had thrown my way. I felt the fight drain out of me as quickly as it had risen, replaced by something colder and more final. My father stared at his hands. Your brother was supposed to get engaged next month. Susan's been planning their wedding, talking about family traditions, about your grandmother's ring. When I went to get it from the safe, it wasn't there. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. So you assumed I took it. You were the only one with the combination besides your mother. You'd been in the house for Christmas, had access to everything. His voice grew smaller with each word, as if he was finally hearing how it sounded spoken aloud. Did you ask me? I said quietly. Before calling the police, before coming here tonight, did you pick up the phone and ask your daughter if she'd taken your grandmother's ring? Silence stretched between us like an ocean. In the distance, music drifted from the harbor club, the sound of a celebration continuing despite the wreckage he'd tried to create. The band was playing something slow and sweet, probably the song David and I had chosen for our first dance as husband and wife. I called your mother after the police left, he said finally. Asked her to check the safe again. She found the ring right where we left it, buried under some old documents. I'd looked right past it. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battle that should never have been fought. All of this, the accusations, the police, the public humiliation, had been based on his inability to find a ring that had never been missing. His need to blame me for problems I hadn't created had turned him into someone I didn't recognize. I'm sorry, he said, the words falling like stones into still water. I'm sorry for tonight, for the wedding, for everything. I don't know how to fix this. I looked at this man who'd taught me to salute before I could properly tie my shoes, who'd insisted on military bearing at the dinner table and perfect posture during family photographs. The man who'd been so proud when I'd been accepted to the Naval Academy, who'd driven 6 hours to attend my commissioning ceremony, who'd called me his trailblazer when I'd earned my dolphins. Somewhere between that proud father and the broken man sitting in this parking lot, something had gone wrong. Maybe it was my success, achievements that outpaced anything he'd accomplished. Maybe it was the distance, physical and emotional, that military life had carved between us. Maybe it was simply the fear that his daughter had grown beyond his ability to understand or control. You can't fix this, I said softly. Not tonight, maybe not ever, but you can stop trying to break it worse. David stepped closer, his presence a reminder that I wasn't alone in this parking lot confrontation, that I had people who chose to stand beside me instead of against me. Sir, he said, addressing my father with the respect due someone's parent despite everything that had happened. Sarah's been hoping you'd come around. that family would matter more than pride. Tonight, you made your choice clear. My father looked at David for the first time since we'd approached his car. "You're a good man," he said. "Better than she deserved from this family." "No," David replied firmly. "She deserved better from her family. She deserved parents who celebrated her achievements instead of resenting them. She deserved a father who showed up to walk her down the aisle instead of sending police to arrest her at the reception." The truth of those words settled over us like fog rolling in from the harbor. In the silence that followed, I heard the sound of my own breathing, steady and controlled despite the chaos that had defined this day. Military training had taught me to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from mission objectives, to function under pressure that would break civilian minds. "I should go," my father said, reaching for the ignition. "Let you get back to your party." "Dad." The word stopped him, his hand frozen on the key. I'd called him that automatically, muscle memory from 3 decades of being his daughter. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done." He nodded without looking at me. "I know. If you want to be part of my life going forward, it has to be different. No more assumptions, no more accusations, no more trying to control decisions you weren't consulted about. I'm not your little girl anymore. I haven't been for a long time." "I know," he repeated, softer this time. "And if you can't accept the woman I've become, the career I've built, the life I've chosen, then we're finished. Not because I hate you, but because I won't keep fighting the same battles over and over." He started the engine, the sound cutting through the night air like a final punctuation mark. "Congratulations on your wedding," he said through the open window. "You looked beautiful tonight." I watched his taillights disappear into traffic, red dots fading into the stream of Norfolk evening commuters. David's arm encircled my waist, pulling me against his side as we stood in the parking lot watching my father drive away from my wedding day, the same way he'd driven away from everything else that mattered. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle against my ear. I considered the question seriously. Was I okay? My family had abandoned my wedding, my father had tried to have me arrested at my own reception, and I'd just told the man who raised me that we were finished if he couldn't change. By most measures, this had been the worst possible way for a wedding day to end. But standing there in David's arms, surrounded by the salt air and ship lights of a harbor that had become home, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The weight I'd been carrying for months, the hope that had turned toxic, the desperate need for approval from people who'd proven they couldn't give it, all of it was finally gone. "Yeah," I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in years. "I think I am." The music from the Harbor Club grew louder as we walked back toward the entrance, the sound of a celebration that had survived everything my father had thrown at it. Through the windows, I could see guests dancing, Eleanor organizing a conga line with the efficiency of a military operation, Jake spinning his wife across the polished floor while their children giggled from nearby tables. This was my family now, the people who'd chosen to stand with me when blood relations had chosen to stand against me, the colleagues who'd traveled hundreds of miles to witness my happiness, the in-laws who'd welcomed me with open arms and hearts, the friends who'd rallied around us when the storm hit, instead of running for shelter. As we reached the ballroom doors, David paused and took my hands in his. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, using my new name like a gift he was presenting. "Ready to dance with your husband?" That night, as we danced under lights that caught my wedding dress like captured starlight, I realized something my father had never understood. Family isn't about blood or obligation or shared last names. It's about who shows up when the storms hit. It's about who chooses love over pride, who celebrates your victories instead of resenting them, who stands beside you when everyone else walks away. If you're watching this and you've ever felt abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you most, remember this. You get to choose your family. You get to decide who deserves a seat at your table and who gets left standing in parking lots with their regrets. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from people who can't see your worth. And sometimes the family you build is stronger. than the one you were born into. The empty chairs at my wedding weren't symbols of failure. They were proof that I'd finally learned the difference between being alone and being free.